In this presentation, we'll be looking at some of the options available to Francis and Clare, options which they refused. Their choice to live according to the gospel was on a menu, we might say, and the preferred items on that menu were rules that had been earlier approved officially by the church. This was important because in November of 1215, just a few years after Francis and Clare had started their experiment in gospel life, the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that no new religious rules were to be approved. Any new community would need to accept a previously approved rule. Among those were some of the classic rules of religious life. The rule of Saint Benedict, for example, which was considered the standard for Western monasticism, at least since the 9th century. We had the more recent reforms by the Cistercians, made popular by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and in the 13th century particularly, the Cistercian reform was considered perhaps the best, the ideal form of religious community life, at least by people like Cardinal Ugolino, later Pope Gregory IX, who was himself somewhat of an expert on new forms of religious life, a great lover of the Cistercian reform. But there was also another, and perhaps a little less well known, the rule that was used by communities of Reformed clergy, particularly devout clergy in large cities, often associated with a cathedral. These were the clerics regular or canons regular, a group of ordained men who lived together in a life that was partly priestly ministry and partly monastic observance. The rule that they followed was not that of Saint Benedict or of the Cistercian monks, which was really for isolated rural monasteries. Rather, they looked back to the writings of Saint Augustine. His experiment with the clergy of his own diocese of Hippo, including some friends of his, who tried to live together as a community, sharing what they had in common and supporting each other in their priestly ministry. This rule of St. Augustine was another option available to the new communities being founded by Francis and Clare, though not consistent with their view of living according to the pattern of the gospel. We will see a couple of examples of what this new model looked like when compared to the previous items on the menu. In this presentation, we will examine the topic of choosing the gospel as rule of life. That is, we'll be looking at how Francis and Clare embrace the gospel life, vita evangelica. When we think about the gospel life, it may seem to us a commonplace today. If we ask, how is a Christian to live? We would say, well, to live according to the gospel, according to the teaching and the example of Jesus that we read and hear when the gospel is presented to us as a text to read and proclaimed as the word in the liturgy. Francis and Clare choose the gospel, but they choose it rather than the Acts of the Apostles as their model for a way of life. And this choice, at their time in the 13th century, was considered controversial. The reasoning of church authorities would go something like this. Such a life was intended really only for the years of the public ministry of Jesus. That is, when Jesus was with the disciples on the roads of Galilee and Judea, as they were traveling along with him in his ministry of preaching, heralding the coming of the kingdom of God, healing, feeding the multitudes. That way of life was unique to that period of 3 years. That was the period they usually assigned, the years of the public ministry. And church authorities for centuries had presumed that after Pentecost, after the resurrection and ascension of the Lord, all Christian communities would be based more or less closely on the example of the early community at Jerusalem as described in the second book of Acts. This presumption by church authorities, that is what everybody was supposed to know, can explain why it took many years for Francis and Clare to receive approval for their way of life according to the gospel. We need to ask ourselves the question, what were the existing rules before Francis and Clare? That is, those authorities on which church leaders relied and which were suggested, as we will see briefly, as models for Clare and Francis themselves to follow. Just to choose the 3 that were probably best known at the time, a rule from the 6th century, written in Italy, the rule of Saint Benedict, or rule for monks. The second, a rule that comes from writings of Saint Augustine in the 5th century, but really popularized as the rule of Saint Augustine in the 12th century, that is, just 100 years or so before Francis and Clare. And in the same century, what was called the rule of Saint Bernard, which in fact was a popularization of customs and constitutions that were used by Cistercian monks. Let's begin with the rule of Benedict, perhaps the most famous rule for monastic life in the Western Church. The rule for monks was composed by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, but it is not entirely original. Rather, Benedict is drawing on earlier monastic traditions, those from Egypt in the 4th and 5th centuries, and from Italy itself. For example, a text called The Rule of the Master, which was clearly an important influence on Benedict. Overall, this rule for monks broadly follows the model of the Book of Acts, that is, the life of the apostles leading the community in Jerusalem, what was called the Vita Apostolica. Notice that this so-called apostolic life does not have the same connotation that it has today, implying a community dedicated to works of the apostolate. Rather, it refers to the book of the Acts of the Apostles. What is called today the Rule of St. Augustine is actually composed of excerpts from his writings from the 5th century from Northern Africa, but were used by clerics regular, that is, by communities of priests following the life of the apostles, but adding to what was done in monasteries, the addition of public preaching. Very often, these groups, sometimes called canons regular or Augustinian canons, were located near cathedrals and in urban centers, where public preaching in the growing towns of the Middle Ages was what they believed an important and essential dimension of the life and ministry of the apostles in the early church. Thus, they called their life the truly apostolic life, vita vere apostolica, because they added to the traditional elements that of the public preaching of the gospel. The rule of Bernard is in fact not a rule at all. Bernard, like other members of the Cistercian reform, followed the rule of Saint Benedict and did so in a particularly strict way. What is referred to as the rule of Bernard is in fact the Book of Customs, consuetudines in Latin, used by Cistercian monks for their reformed observance of a monastic life following the rule of Saint Benedict. It's associated with the name Bernard because the Cistercian reform generally was made popular and expanded greatly by the efforts of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Once again, we're a full 100 years before the life and rule of Francis and Clare. There's an interesting story in the Assisi compilation, abbreviated here AC, in section 18, where we learn how Francis refuses earlier rules. Let's just listen to the story. Many wise and learned brothers told the Lord Cardinal, this is Cardinal Ugolino, who later became Pope Gregory, who was present at the chapter, that he should persuade Blessed Francis to follow the advice of those same wise brothers and allow himself to be guided by them for the time being. When the cardinal actually presents this proposal to Francis, he had a very sharp reaction. My brothers, God has called me by the way of simplicity and showed me the way of simplicity. I do not want you to mention to me any rule, whether of St. Augustine or of St. Bernard or of St. Benedict. And the Lord told me what he wanted. He wanted me to be a new fool in the world. These are very strong words. We can imagine the embarrassment or the surprise of Cardinal Ugolino, the Pope's representative, at this meeting of a general chapter of the Friars, probably in the summer of 1220 or 1221, the so-called chapter of Mats. The elder brothers, these wise brothers, had clearly suggested that Francis should abandon his idea of composing a new kind of rule, one based on the gospel. Rather, since they had been working on this rule for many years, we sometimes call it the rule of 1221 or the earlier rule, that rule had not received official approval. The safer bet would be to take one of the previously approved rules, those based on the Acts of the Apostles, an idea that Francis did not accept at all. In a similar way, we see a refusal by Clare. Hers is specifically the refusal of property that was offered by Cardinal Ugolino after he became Pope as Gregory IX. The legend of St. Clare, in chapter 9, tells us a story which is also repeated in the testimony of several of the sisters at the process of canonization of St. Clare, just the year after her death. Here is the account, probably written by Thomas of Celano in the Legend of Clare. Pope Gregory was attempting to persuade her that because of the events of the times and the dangers of the world, she should consent to have some possessions, which he himself willingly offered. She resisted with a very strong spirit and in no way would acquiesce. To this, the Pope replied, "If you fear for your vow," that would be the vow of poverty, "we absolve you from it. the response of Clare was very direct. "Holy Father," she said, "I will never in any way wish to be absolved from the following of Christ." Without saying so explicitly, Clare is claiming that the form of life which she received from Francis and which is enshrined in the heart of her rule or form of life in chapter 6, with its determination of poverty as one of the characteristics of the followers of Christ, that way of life, according to the gospel, meant that she could not accept the Pope's offer, which was clearly intended to be helpful to her, misunderstanding the importance of the gospel way of life in poverty for Clare. If we look to the writings of Francis and Clare themselves, to live according to the gospel was something that they said very explicitly and left as a heritage to their followers up to the present day. Francis, in his testament, probably composed in the final months or weeks of his life, reflected on what was most important in the early days of his conversion. And there he recalls very specifically this event, which he calls a revelation. "No one showed me what I should do, but the Most High revealed to me that I should live according to the form of the Holy Gospel." That revelation that Francis received, we will see later, came in the form of hearing the gospel and reading the gospel, and recognizing in the words of Jesus given there that this was the vocation, this was the call toward which God was moving him during the process of his conversion. In her own form of life, that is, her rule, approved literally on her deathbed, Clare recalls the most important commitment that she and her sisters have made in this regard. The form of life of the Order of the Poor Sisters that Blessed Francis established is this: to observe the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ by living in obedience, without anything of one's own, and in chastity. That second phrase, "without anything of one's own," in Latin, sine proprio, is what is often called the vow of poverty. It is, more radically, the vow not to claim anything as one's own, that is, not to possess. It will be an important point of discussion, difference, and defiance when Cardinal Ugolino, later Pope as Gregory IX, attempts to force Clare to give up this aspect of what she considers an essential element of the following of the gospel. If we look at the attitude of church authorities, we would have to say that they were discouraging this new form of life. Francis and his brothers wait a full 14 years for final approval of a rule that is based on the form of the Holy Gospel. As we have seen over the course of those many years, Francis and the brothers were urged again and again to take an earlier approved monastic rule, such as that of Benedict, or that of the clerics regular of Augustine, or the Cistercian constitutions and customs of Bernard of Clairvaux. When the rule was finally approved for Francis and his brothers on November 29th, 1223, it was the end of a 14-year project to gain approval for this new way of life. But look what happens to Clare. She joined Francis in 1212, just 3 years after his first group of brothers received preliminary approval from Pope Innocent III. But she only received on her deathbed in 1253 the final approval of her way of life. That is, Clare and her sisters wait 40 years for final approval of a form of life which she identifies with the words, to observe the Holy Gospel. She will say, in that form of life, that she received an early form of life from Francis when she was first at San Damiano, that is, in those early years around 1212. But Cardinal Ugolino, we know, had insisted again and again that she should accept the rule of Saint Benedict and tried to impose on the community at San Damiano customs that were taken from the Cistercian constitutions, that is, the so-called Rule of Bernard. Efforts that Clare and the sisters resisted, claiming that they already had a form of life that came from Francis. We must ask ourselves, what is new about this gospel form of life? What was it that struck church authorities as being so different from what they were used to in the common ways of organizing and supporting communities of monks and nuns? This way of life is as old as the gospel. That is, if we think about it carefully, it is claiming to be older than the apostolic life, which is recounted in the book of Acts. That is, it comes from the period before the passion, resurrection, and ascension of the Lord, and the event of Pentecost, when the church was born. It reflects not the life of Peter and James, the apostles at Jerusalem, but rather the life of Jesus with his disciples, men and women, traveling, preaching, healing, feeding, during the years of his life and ministry throughout Galilee, into Samaria, into Judea. We could rightly say that this model is that of the church, small c, before the church, capital C. That is, it's the church of Jesus, the church of believers gathered with the Lord before Pentecost. It has a very simple structure of leadership. The only teacher is Christ. All others are disciples. It includes no titles like Father, for example, the typical monastic title of abbot, from Abba, meaning father. Rather, all are considered brothers and sisters. There is no donation of property to the community on entering, and there is no common property for income. That was the model in the second chapter of the book of Acts, to put all things in common. And it includes begging alms when support from work is not sufficient to meet needs, something that was really not anticipated in the apostolic life of the church at Jerusalem. This is a life with no fixed residence, no property for income, and it looks back to the example of Jesus and the disciples in phrases such as these taken from Matthew's Gospel. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. Matthew 9. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Matthew 8. Jesus said to him, the rich young man, if you wish to be perfect, go, sell your possessions, and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. In reading the gospel and in hearing the gospel, Francis and Clare and their brothers and sisters began to form a picture of what a life based on these instructions and examples of Jesus would look like. Another example is that of economic support. How would such a community of disciples survive? Here, looking to Luke's gospel, we see one of those examples that impressed Francis and Clare. Soon afterwards, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza. Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. From Luke chapter 8. Here we see a picture of the community of disciples, men and women, gathered around Jesus, and how it is through the support of these very devoted women that we eventually are able to see the economic survivability or sustainability of this community of disciples. In this presentation, we have looked at the gospel life of Francis and Clare. Thank you.